don't sign anything. If you still want to see the kids? I was standing in the kitchen, my hand lightly shaking as I held the phone, listening to my daughter's voice, the daughter who had disappeared from my life more than 15 years ago. Say those words as if I were a stranger. That sentence didn't just stop me in my tracks. It forced me to face a question I had avoided for half my life, whether what I had been doing for the past 16 years was truly protection or just holding on. Families sometimes don't fall apart because of great evils, but because of small things left unattended for too long. I used to believe that as long as I stayed, as long as I didn't leave like others did, everything would somehow be okay. But if even staying can cause harm, then where is the line? I asked myself that question right there in my old kitchen, where the smell of morning coffee still lingered in the air. And then I understood. This didn't start with today's phone call. It started in a winter long ago, when I had just turned 51. If you're listening to this story from some city out there, leave me a comment and let me know. And if you've ever witnessed or lived through fragile boundaries in a family, tap like so this story can reach more people. I also want to be clear about something from the very beginning, before going any further. The story I'm telling isn't meant to confirm any objective truth, and it certainly isn't meant to judge right or wrong. It's been pieced together and edited from life experiences, looked back on through my own memories and personal feelings. Memory, as you know, isn't always perfect. I'm telling this to reflect, not to judge, and definitely not to encourage anyone to follow any of the choices in this story. That year, I had been retired for a few months. My name is Maggie Holloway, a widow living in a small Midwestern town where winters are long and so quiet you can almost hear the snow settling on the windowsill. My husband died young from a stroke. My children were grown, each living their own lives somewhere else. The two-bedroom house suddenly felt far too large for one person. In those first months of retirement, I tried to fill my days with small routines. Waking early to make coffee, walking around the neighborhood, reading the print newspaper like I had done for 30 years while working. If I had to describe my life back then in one word, it would be calm. Until one December afternoon when Laura appeared at my front door. She didn't knock hard or urgently. When I opened the door, Laura stood there with two children, a boy and a girl bundled in thick scarves. She looked thinner than I remembered, her eyes carrying the kind of exhaustion you see in someone who's traveled a very long way without rest. "Mom," Laura said, her voice quick and low, "I just need you to help me for a little while. Just a few weeks. I need to get myself together." I didn't ask, get together what? And I didn't ask how long a few weeks really meant. I simply opened the door wider, a reflex left over from when she was still a child. The two kids stepped inside, their shoes covered in snow, their hands gripping each other tightly. They didn't cry or speak, just looked around my living room as if trying to memorize a strange place. Laura set a small duffel bag beside the couch and handed me a set of keys. "I'll call," she said. "I promise I'll call." No paperwork, no agreement, no clear promise beyond a few weeks. Just the cold keys in my hand and a vague unease creeping up my spine. But I didn't stop Laura. I didn't ask more questions. I didn't even hold her for as long as a mother probably should. I just stood there watching her turn and walk back into the snow, telling myself she'd be back soon. In those first days, I lived in a state of waiting. I left Laura's bedroom untouched, afraid to disturb anything. I kept my phone close at all times, even when I was in the kitchen or out in the yard. The children stayed, quiet in a way that was almost unsettling. The older boy, Ethan, I remembered, tried hard to act strong. The younger one, Lily, startled awake from her sleep. I comforted them, cooked simple meals, told old stories I'd forgotten I even knew. A few weeks passed quickly. Then Christmas came. Laura called once, said things were not ready yet, and asked me to give her more time. I said okay, my voice sounding strangely calm to my own ears. I hung 2 extra stockings by the fireplace and wrote the kids' names on them in red marker as if they had always belonged there. Winter dragged on. Snow melted, then fell again. The kids started school near my house. My name appeared on school forms, first as grandmother, then simply as guardian. I signed without thinking much, knowing someone had to. Laura called less and less. Every call came with a different explanation, but always the same ending. I'm not ready yet. I began adjusting my life without noticing. I stopped taking long morning walks because I had to make breakfast. I no longer finished the newspaper because I was interrupted by small questions. I stopped long phone calls with old friends because evenings were for homework. It all happened so naturally, like slipping back into a role I once knew well. Some nights when the house was quiet, I sat alone in the living room and wondered if I was doing the right thing. I wasn't angry at Laura. I didn't see myself as a martyr. I just felt a low, steady worry, like standing on a bridge without seeing either end. But then morning came. Ethan and Lily woke up, and those questions were pushed aside. Late one evening, while searching for spare batteries in Laura's old drawer, my hand touched something cold and solid. It was Laura's old phone, the kind no one uses anymore. The screen was dark, but when I pressed the button, a notification appeared. A draft message. Never sent. I stood there a long time, the phone in my hand, and for the first time in years, I felt that maybe I had missed something more important than simply staying. I put Laura's old phone back in the drawer, closing it very gently, as if even the smallest sound might shatter something fragile inside me. That night, I barely slept. Not because of the unsent message, but because I realized I had stopped waiting for a specific timeline. A few weeks had become a blurry idea, drifting somewhere between rushed breakfasts and exhausted evenings. My retirement income wasn't much. After paying the mortgage, utilities, and insurance, there was just enough left for one person living carefully. With 2 kids, I had to recalculate everything. I learned to shop seasonally, switch familiar brands for cheaper ones, cut back on small social outings I once enjoyed. I didn't feel like I was sacrificing. I was just managing, like any adult does when life quietly places another responsibility in their hands. My mornings started earlier. I woke Ethan and Lily, helped them into coats and scarves, and walked them to the bus stop in the biting cold. Some days, I watched the bus disappear down the snowy road and wondered where Laura was at that moment. But that question usually faded quickly, replaced by the mental list of things to do. Buy cold medicine for Lily, apply for reduced school fees, call the clinic. At school, I grew used to the curious looks. At my first parent meeting, I sat slightly off to the side as if I were only temporary. The teacher smiled kindly and called my name, but the line where the kid's mother's name should have been remained blank. I didn't correct it. I didn't explain. I just answered questions about grades, health, and the things that were immediate and concrete. At the clinic, the nurse called my name when it was our turn. "Relationship to the patient?" she asked, still typing. "Grandmother," I answered. After a while, the question disappeared. My name was automatically listed as the primary contact. I signed consent forms without my hands shaking like they had the first time. Everything changed gradually, without a single moment big enough to mark the shift. Midway through that school year, during a short after-hours meeting, Ethan's teacher looked at me, tilted her head slightly, and asked casually, "Where's their mother?" The question wasn't sharp or intrusive. It came out of habit. I was quiet for a few seconds, feeling my heartbeat slow. Then I said, evenly, "I'm here." The room paused for a brief moment, long enough for me to realize that the answer was both true and not entirely. Driving home that day, I thought a lot. I had never intended to take Laura's place. I never thought of myself as the kid's mother in the biological sense. But I couldn't deny that I had begun filling the space she left behind. And with that came a new worry. Was my presence quietly becoming an irreversible replacement? Children, I realized, don't ask who gave birth to them. They ask who stays when they need someone. I believe that, believed presence mattered more than titles. But I also began to wonder, if Laura came back one day, what would my place in Ethan and Lily's lives be? And more importantly, was I doing something that made that return harder? Laura sent money sometimes, not regularly, not much, never with an address or explanation. Sometimes it was enough to cover groceries for a week, sometimes just a few $dozen, like a reminder that she still remembered. I didn't ask questions. I didn't save envelopes or receipts as proof. I treated it as something private between Laura and me, not something to measure or balance. Some people suggested I contact family services to make things official. I listened, but chose silence. Not because I feared complications, but because I wasn't ready to name what was happening. Once you name something, you have to face its consequences. And at that time, I just wanted everything to keep moving, even if I didn't know where it was going. Time passed quietly. A few weeks turned into a few years without me noticing where the boundary had been crossed. I stayed in the same house, made coffee every morning, stood at the bus stop in winter cold. But deep inside, I began to understand that I had crossed an invisible line, not with one big decision, but with hundreds of small ones, each reasonable in its moment. That's when I realized some boundaries aren't marked by signs or paperwork. They only appear once you've gone too far to turn back. I didn't tell anyone I was tired, not because I wasn't, but because I didn't know how to say it properly. In a small town like this, people know each other through quick greetings on porches, polite questions at the post office or grocery store. "How are you, Maggie?" I always nodded, smiled, said things were fine, and in some ways, that wasn't entirely a lie. I still woke up each morning, cooked dinner, took the kids to school, but some afternoons, when I closed the door behind me, I felt the weight settle clearly on my shoulders. I hid that exhaustion out of habit. I didn't complain to neighbors or call old friends to vent. I was afraid that if I said it out loud, it would become something too big to ignore, and I wasn't ready for that. I just wanted to keep everything manageable, even though deep down I knew I was unsteady. At home, life slowed into a new rhythm. Ethan and Lily grew used to it. They knew where to leave their shoes, when to turn off the TV, which evenings I liked to read in my armchair. One night, while I was washing dishes, Lily ran into the kitchen, wrapped her arms around my legs from behind, and whispered, "Mom." I turned quickly, my heart pounding. I corrected her right away, almost by reflex. "Call me Grandma, sweetheart." Lily looked up, a little confused, then nodded and ran off like nothing had happened. But later, I stopped correcting them. Sometimes Ethan called me Mom when he needed help with homework. Sometimes Lily said it in the middle of the night after a nightmare. I heard it. I knew it. And I stayed silent. I told myself it was just a habit, that it didn't mean anything deeper. But each time, a feeling rose in me that was hard to name, warm and heavy at the same time. One evening, sitting alone in the living room after the kids were asleep, I blamed myself for not correcting it again. I wondered if my silence was a kind of quiet consent. I loved them, that I couldn't deny. But I was also afraid. Afraid I was going too far. Afraid that one day Laura would return and find something had changed beyond repair. And in that fear, there was guilt. Guilt because I knew I wasn't entirely innocent in this closeness. Laura still called, but rarely. The calls were short, her voice tired, as if she were speaking while doing something else. She asked about the kids' health, a few general questions about school. I answered just enough. When I waited for words like, "I'm coming back soon," or "I'm trying to arrange things," she always changed the subject or ended the call with a rushed excuse. I didn't push. I didn't ask about money or dates. I didn't want to be pressure, and I didn't want to hear promises she might not even believe herself. Sometimes, after hanging up, I stared at the phone for a long time, wondering if my silence was another form of avoidance. Then I reminded myself that everyone moves at their own pace, and some questions asked too early only make things messier. I started writing in an old notebook with a worn cover, bought from a discount store. I didn't write every day. Sometimes weeks passed without a word, sometimes just a few lines before bed. I didn't write to accuse anyone or catalog Laura's absences. I wrote to understand myself, to name feelings I didn't have time to face during the day. In those pages, I admitted to myself that I loved Ethan and Lily deeply, but with fear woven through that love. I wrote about small moments that made me feel more like a mother than a grandmother, and I wrote about the quiet worry that, if I wasn't careful, that love could turn into a kind of replacement I never consciously chose. Some nights, when the wind rattled the windows and the house made the familiar sounds of age, I sat on my bed with the notebook on my lap and wondered whether I was doing the right thing, or just the easiest thing. I didn't have a clear answer. I only knew that the next morning I would wake up early, make breakfast, and see the kids out the door. And in that routine, I slowly realized there were things I didn't tell anyone, not because they weren't important, but because I wasn't brave enough to face them yet. Everything shifted on a morning that seemed ordinary. I was folding laundry when the phone rang. It was the school. The secretary's voice was a little rushed, trying to stay calm but clearly worried. Ethan had slipped during recess and scraped his knee. It wasn't serious, but he needed to be checked in the nurse's office. I dropped the clothes, grabbed my coat, and drove over, repeating one simple thought. It's just a small thing. At school, Ethan sat on the exam table, paler than usual, but smiling when he saw me. Lily stood beside him, holding his hand tightly. I bent down, checked the scrape, feeling both relieved and tense. The nurse handed me a stack of forms and said she needed my signature to authorize an X-ray, just in case. I took the pen, skimmed the familiar lines, then stopped at a blank space at the bottom. "Who are you on the record?" the nurse asked, gently, clearly. The question froze me. I looked at the paper, then at her waiting face. In that brief moment, all the years collapsed into a single point: grandmother, temporary caregiver, or simply the one who was there. I opened my mouth, ready to answer like always, but the words caught. I thought of Laura, not being there. I thought of Ethan, wincing in pain. "I'm the responsible one," I said, my voice low and slow, as if weighing each word. The nurse nodded and didn't ask anything else. She turned away to process the paperwork, leaving me with the pen and a strange sensation spreading through my body. I signed my name on the final line, my hand slightly shaking, the ink uneven. It was the first time I'd said those words out loud, and I knew, even if no one else heard, it had changed something. We went home that afternoon after the doctor confirmed it was only a minor injury. Ethan's knee was carefully bandaged. Lily was given a small candy to calm her. On the drive back, I drove slower than usual, my hands gripping the steering wheel. I didn't turn on the radio. The silence in the car was so thick I could hear my own breathing. At home, I helped Ethan into bed and made Lily a warm glass of milk. When everything settled, I went into the bathroom, locked the door, and leaned against the sink. My hands were trembling. Not violently, but enough for me to realize I wasn't as composed as I'd been at school. I looked at myself in the mirror, more gray in my hair than I remembered, tired eyes still trying to look steady. I wondered when I had become ready to say, "I'm responsible," in my daughter's place, and whether it was a step I'd never be able to undo. That evening, after the kids were asleep, I sat alone in the living room with only the soft yellow light of a table lamp. I opened the drawer where I kept Laura's old papers, originally looking for health insurance information. My hand brushed against a thin stack I hadn't touched in years. Among old bills and junk mail was a set of printed pages, the corners yellowed. It was an email, not one I'd received, but a printed draft with an unfinished subject line. I recognized Laura's writing immediately, short, broken sentences, as if she'd been thinking while typing. The message stopped midway, no greeting, no signature. She wrote about feeling overwhelmed, about being afraid she wasn't good enough to come back, about believing the kids would be better off staying with me. Then it ended abruptly, as if she'd deleted the urge to hit send. I held the pages for a long time without reading them all, just staring at the opening lines. In the quiet room, A chill ran down my spine. I didn't know when Laura had written that email or why she'd printed it and left it behind. I only knew that maybe all these years I'd been seeing everything from too narrow an angle. I folded the paper, set it on the table, and sat there in silence. Outside, the wind moved through the bare branches, making that familiar winter sound. I realized that what I said that morning at school wasn't just a temporary answer. It was a sign that I had reached a crossroads I'd never prepared for. And in my hands right now was an old piece of Laura, never sent, but enough to make me understand this story was far more complicated than simply who stayed and who left. I read that email slowly, one line at a time, as if the words might disappear if I went too fast. Laura didn't write anything specific about dates or plans. There was no, "I'll be back in the spring," and there was no, "I need 6 more months." Just short, scattered sentences about exhaustion. She wrote that every morning she woke up feeling out of breath, that the thought of coming back made her hands shake so badly she couldn't even type, that she was afraid of my eyes, afraid of the neighbors' questions, afraid of having to explain why she hadn't been able to do what everyone thought was obvious. The email stopped there, with no closing, like a breath cut off mid-inhale. I folded the paper and opened it again, trying to find some sign of calculation or selfishness, but there wasn't any. Only an exhaustion spreading through everything, the kind of exhaustion that doesn't need a clear reason. And in that moment, I realized what I hadn't dared to think for years. Laura hadn't disappeared from our lives. She was hiding from herself, hiding from expectations that maybe even I had accidentally put on her shoulders. Realizing that didn't make me feel lighter right away. It made everything more complicated. Because if Laura wasn't someone who left cleanly and for good, then I had stayed with those 2 children in a murky gap, one where no one was completely right and no one was completely wrong. I sat with that email in my hands for a long time, watching the lamplight fall across the old wooden table, and I wondered how much of my daughter I had truly understood through all the years of being her mother. Some people leave not out of malice, but because they can't stand themselves. That thought came to me gently, not dramatic, but enough to make me stop. I wondered whether forgiveness needs an apology, or if sometimes forgiveness is simply accepting that the other person didn't have enough strength to stay, even if they wanted to. I also understood that my memory, like any memory, may have been worn down and rearranged by personal feeling. The story I was telling myself wasn't the full truth for everyone involved. I couldn't, and didn't want to, assign motives to Laura. I only knew how it felt to me, how I looked back at scattered pieces through the lens of someone who has lived long enough to know that things are rarely just one-sided. After that night, I didn't change my life suddenly. I still woke up early, still made breakfast, still took Ethan and Lily to school, but a new question began forming in my mind. Where is my boundary? Not the boundary between me and Laura, but the boundary between caring and replacing. I loved those 2 children, and I had no intention of leaving them, but I also didn't want to erase their mother's place by accident, even if that place was empty and fragile. I started thinking about more practical things I had deliberately avoided before, not by looking for a lawyer or filing paperwork, but by trying to understand what I could do to protect the kids while not slamming Laura's door shut. Those thoughts made me tired, but it was a different kind of tired, like sore muscles after you've pushed them too long. Instead of turning to legal processes, I went to a counselor in the next town over. She was a few years older than me, her voice low and unhurried, not quick to offer advice. I told her, not everything, but enough for her to understand the situation. I told her about the unsent email, about the guilt of being called mom, about the fear that one day everything would collapse because I'd been standing in the wrong place. She listened, nodded, and asked me just one question. What do you want to protect most? That question stayed with me the entire drive home. I realized I didn't only want to protect the kids from instability. I also wanted to protect myself from becoming someone I never intended to become. And somewhere deep down, I also wanted to protect Laura from the feeling that she had lost everything just because she wasn't strong enough at the right moment. I put the email back in the drawer, but I no longer saw it as a heavy secret. It became a reminder that this story wasn't as simple as I once believed. I kept raising the kids, but I started paying closer attention to small signs, to questions I needed to answer more honestly, even when the answers weren't clear yet. Outside the window, winter slowly gave way to longer days. The snow melted, revealing damp ground and the first tiny buds. I knew I was entering a different stage, one where I couldn't rely only on routine and silence, but at least this time, I didn't feel like I was walking in complete darkness. Time never warns you before it decides to speed up. One day, I realized Ethan was nearly half a head taller than me, his voice noticeably deeper whenever he called down from upstairs. Lily no longer trotted along behind me. She started closing her bedroom door and playing music loud enough for me to hear, but not understand. Their teen years arrived quietly, without any single moment marking the change. It came in small shifts that added up into a distance I had to learn to accept. They knew I wasn't their biological mother. I never lied about that. From the beginning, I called Laura their mother, even as that name grew faint in everyday conversations. As he got older, Ethan started asking more, not in accusation, but with the curiosity of a child trying to piece his life together. I answered what I knew, without embellishing, without guessing. Lily listened more than she asked. Sometimes her eyes rested on me for a long time, as if weighing something she wasn't ready to say. One evening after dinner, Ethan stayed in the kitchen while I was washing dishes. He leaned against the counter, quiet for a moment, then said slowly, "You didn't give birth to me, but you never left me." He didn't raise his voice. It wasn't dramatic. It sounded like a conclusion he'd been thinking about for a long time. I stood with my back to him, my hands still in warm water, feeling my chest tighten. I didn't turn around, and I didn't answer. I just kept washing the last plate, dried my hands, and pulled out a pan to make dinner like I did every day. I didn't answer, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I was afraid my voice would shake if I spoke. Some sentences once said, "Stay with you for a long time." I needed time to place it where it belonged in my heart instead of reacting immediately. Ethan didn't repeat it. He went upstairs, leaving me alone in the kitchen with the smell of onions and hot oil gently sizzling on the stove. Laura was completely silent during those years. No calls, no texts, no money sent. That silence was different from earlier gaps. It was thicker, more sealed, like a door closed carefully and fully. I didn't know where she was or how she was living. Sometimes I thought about trying to find out, asking someone to check, but I stopped myself. I had learned that some doors, if you knock too hard, only hurt both sides. I started thinking more about Ethan and Lily's future, not the specific kind, what school, what career, but their emotional future. I wondered what would happen when I no longer had the strength to be here every day. I didn't start legal paperwork or draw up documents. I just prepared myself, and I prepared them in the ways I knew. I taught Ethan how to manage allowance money, not through long lectures, but by letting him make small mistakes. I taught Lily how to cook a few simple meals, not because she would have to fend for herself soon, but because I wanted her to know she could. I talked to them about leaving home, about the mix of excitement and fear when you step into the world. I didn't say I would always be here. I only said that wherever they went, they would always have the right to come back, even if one day I wasn't in this house anymore. On quiet evenings, when the kids were in their own corners with their own worlds, I sat in the living room reading or knitting. I thought of Laura, not with anger anymore, not with blame, but with a sadness that had softened. I wondered whether she knew how much her children had grown, what they had said, who they were becoming. But I didn't write a letter or leave a message. I didn't want to disturb a silence that Laura might need just to keep going. Sometimes, rarely, I felt like I was standing between two shores. On one side was the responsibility I'd carried for years. On the other was the truth that I couldn't keep everything intact forever. I reminded myself that everything would have to change, whether I was ready or not. Change isn't always loss. Sometimes it's simply a different shape of continuing. Late one night, I turned off the kitchen light and stood there, looking at the house in the dark. I could see the marks of time, scuffs on the walls, a chair with a loose screw, an entry rug worn thin. I could also see what couldn't be seen, attachment, words that were never answered, roles that shifted without anyone declaring them. I knew I couldn't control the future, and I couldn't fix the past. The only thing I could do was be here one more day, with a clearer awareness of my own boundaries. And with that awareness, I began to accept that what I'd called stability all those years was really just a pause before everything moved into another stage. I didn't know what that stage would look like. I only knew that when it came, I wouldn't be as shocked as before. The call came late in the afternoon while I was folding a blanket on the sofa. The last sunlight angled through the window, making dust float visibly in the air. The number on the screen wasn't saved, an unfamiliar string of digits that made me hesitate for a couple of beats before picking up. I had gotten so used to expecting nothing from this phone that the ringing sounded like it belonged to someone else's life. "Hello?" I said, my voice so normal it surprised even me. On the other end, there was a brief silence. Then Laura's voice came through. Not loud, not shaky, not like the Laura from 16 years ago. It was lower, slower, as if it had passed through many layers of exhaustion. "Mom, it's me." 2 words, but enough to make me grip the edge of the table. She didn't apologize. She didn't say she had been wrong. She didn't complain or blame anyone. She only said she wanted to talk. That word choice threw me. Talk about what, after all those years of silence? I didn't ask right away. I let Laura continue, let the rhythm of the call find its footing. "I think it's time. I should talk to you," Laura said, like she was reading a sentence she'd rehearsed many times. I could hear a familiar hesitation in her voice, the same hesitation I used to hear when she was about to say something hard. Then, without warning, Laura said something that tightened my chest. "You've done more than your part, Mom." It wasn't sharp. It wasn't accusatory. It was simply a statement laid down gently, but it felt heavy as stone. I didn't react right away. I looked out the window at the grass turning pale yellow and felt my deepest fear being touched. For years, I had asked myself whether I was doing too much, whether my steady presence had accidentally pushed Laura farther away. Hearing her say it herself, even as just one sentence, knocked me off balance for a moment. But at the same time, I realized her voice didn't carry resentment. It sounded like someone trying to set a boundary without being sure where that boundary truly was. Laura kept talking, a little faster now, as if afraid I would cut her off. She said she wasn't calling to take the kids, not calling for money, not calling to change what existed. "I just want to connect," she said. The word connect sounded strange, almost like it didn't belong to us. I wondered if she even knew what she was asking for, or if she was reaching for a safe word to cover something unsteady. I listened, but my thoughts tangled. I had gotten used to having a clear villain to face. Absence, silence, years without explanation. But now, there was no obvious bad person. No one for me to be angry at. No one for me to condemn. Just a daughter who had grown up in ways I hadn't witnessed, standing on the other end of the call, trying to open a door she herself had closed long ago. Laura didn't say much about Ethan and Lily. She asked briefly, like she was afraid to go too deep. I answered just enough. No more, no less, no boasting, no hiding. I realized I was keeping distance, not because I was angry, but because I needed to understand where I stood in this story. There was a long silence between us. I could hear Laura's breathing, steady but heavy. I knew she was waiting for me to say something, maybe reassurance, maybe pushback, but I couldn't answer right away, not because I had nothing to say, but because any answer might send everything down a path I wasn't ready to accept. You don't have to answer me right now, Laura said, her voice softer. I just wanted you to know. The words made my throat go dry. I nodded by reflex, then realized she couldn't see it. I heard you, I said slowly. That was all I could say in that moment, and I knew it was true. Before hanging up, Laura took a deep breath. If you're okay with it, she said, we could meet in person. The last two words were barely spoken, as if she was afraid they would disappear if she said them out loud. I didn't answer immediately. I looked around the familiar room where every object belonged to a life Laura no longer fit into. I could feel hesitation pulling me in two directions. Let me think about it, I said at last. Not a no, not a yes. Laura was quiet for a second, then said she understood. The call ended gently. No sigh, no promises. I set the phone down, my hands still a little shaky. The house was so quiet I could hear the wall clock ticking, steady and emotionless. I knew that from this moment, everything had started moving in a different way. And even though I hadn't answered, Laura's request to meet in person hung in the air like a question with no period. We agreed to meet at a small coffee shop near the highway, a place where people stopped more than they stayed. I arrived 10 minutes early, chose a table by the window, and ordered a hot tea, even though it wasn't cold outside. When Laura walked in, I recognized her immediately, but it still took a beat to match the face in front of me with my old memories. She looked tired. Not so thin it was alarming, not like someone freshly broken by tragedy. Just tired. The tiredness of someone who's been walking too long without ever stopping long enough to rest. She looked around, saw me, and paused. We both stood up almost at the same time, but we didn't hug. Just a small nod, like two people who have known each other a long time, but aren't sure whether to be close or distant. Laura sat down, slid her purse under the chair, and wrapped both hands around the cup of coffee she'd just ordered. I noticed her hands were trembling slightly, as if she was trying to keep herself steady. We started with simple opening lines. The weather, the drive, when this place had changed owners. No one mentioned 16 years right away, and I knew it wasn't avoidance so much as two people unsure how to enter a big story through a small door. Laura was the one who broke the silence. I never thought you'd stay that long. She said it plainly, without accusation or dramatic surprise, but it felt like someone gently tapped on a door that had been shut tight inside me. I didn't argue. I didn't confirm. I just looked at her and realized there was both acknowledgement and helplessness in that sentence. In that moment, I understood that neither of us had been prepared for this. Laura hadn't been prepared to leave the kids for so long. I hadn't been prepared to be the one who stayed for that long. We had stepped into a wordless agreement, each carrying our own assumptions, and then we let time do what it does. Laura described the years in an even voice, jobs changing constantly, temporary places to live, relationships that came and went, nothing big enough to make me gasp, nothing tragic enough to explain everything, just a chain of days, one after another, not exactly failure, not exactly success either. I listened without interrupting, without trying to force cause and effect into order. When it was my turn, I did the same. I talked about Ethan and Lily, but not too much. I talked about them growing up, about ordinary changes. I didn't mention sleepless nights or the times I blamed myself, not because I wanted to hide it, but because I didn't want this meeting to become a balance sheet of merit and fault. There was a moment when Laura stopped and looked straight at me, her eyes not turning away. Suddenly, I realized she was waiting for something decisive. Maybe forgiveness, maybe a late-coming accusation. But I didn't give her either. I just sat there, feeling my daughter's presence after all those years, and let that feeling find its own place. Staying is a choice, not an instinct. That thought became very clear in me. I had chosen to stay, day after day, not because I couldn't leave, but because on each of those days, staying made the most sense. But if someone comes back late, what rights do they still have? The right to be called mom? The right to step into the lives of children who grew up without them? I didn't have an answer, and I wasn't sure an answer even existed. We didn't make any agreement. We didn't promise anything about the future. There were no tears. Laura didn't apologize, and I didn't demand one. Maybe because we both understood that some apologies, when they come too late, only make everything heavier. We ended the meeting with a light handshake, like two people who had said enough for today. On the way home, I drove slower than usual. The familiar road stretched ahead, but I felt like I was moving through it in a different state. Not relief, not pain, just emptiness, like a room had been cleared out, but nothing had been put back yet. When I opened the door and stepped inside, I paused at the threshold. The house was quiet, smelling of old wood and familiar soap. I realized that meeting hadn't closed anything, but it had opened a new space inside me. A space with no noise, no climax, only the truth that this story had moved into another chapter. And even though I didn't know where that chapter would lead, I knew I wasn't standing in the same place anymore. I didn't tell Ethan and Lily right after the meeting. I needed a few days for my feelings to settle, to make sure that when I opened my mouth, I wasn't speaking from my own confusion. One evening, after dinner, when the dishes were put away and the kitchen had returned to its familiar quiet, I asked them to sit down at the table. Not with a serious tone, and not like I was preparing some big announcement. I just said I wanted to talk, and they nodded, each in their own way. I told them about meeting their mother. No embellishing, no softening, no exaggerating. I said that Laura wanted to reconnect, that she hadn't made any demands, and that everything was still open. I stopped there and let the words find their own way. I didn't tell them what they should do. I didn't suggest any path is right. I only said this was their story, and they had the right to feel it in their own way. Ethan reacted first. He stayed quiet for a long time, staring down at the tabletop, his fingers lightly tapping the wood edge like he was counting time. Then he looked up and asked a blunt question. "What do you want us to do?" That question, even though it was short, held all the hesitation of someone standing at a crossroads. I looked him straight in the eye and answered slowly, making sure I wasn't accidentally steering him. "I don't need to be chosen," I said. "I just need you to be yourselves." The words hung in the quiet kitchen. No raised voice, no martyrdom in them. It was simply the truth it had taken me years to name. Lily was different. She didn't say anything right away. She looked at me, then at her brother, then out the window as if she were searching for something to hold on to. Finally, Lily asked softly, "If we want to see Mom, will you be sad?" The question touched a very tender place in me. I didn't answer immediately, not because I didn't know, but because I needed to be sure my answer wouldn't put more weight on her shoulders. "I might be sad," I said honestly, "but that's my feeling, not your responsibility." I watched Lily exhale in relief, as if she'd just been allowed to admit something she'd been carrying for a long time. In the days that followed, their reactions stayed different. Ethan grew quieter, spending more time in his room, listening to music and thinking. Lily asked more, small questions that went straight to the core. What their mother liked, what she used to be like, why things had turned out this way. I answered as best I could, always stopping at the boundary of guessing. I didn't want to speak for Laura, and I didn't want to paint a picture I wasn't even sure about myself. I learned how to step back, both literally and in the way it mattered. I didn't stand outside their door when they were on the phone. I didn't ask after every conversation what they'd said. I let silence have its place. That wasn't easy. Sometimes instinct pulled me forward, wanting to protect, wanting to control. But I reminded myself that love isn't always about being the closest one. No one won in those conversations. No one lost either. There was no neat closure, no shared decision made in a single evening. Just overlapping thoughts, feelings not yet named. And I slowly understood that uncertainty isn't the enemy. Sometimes it's the space each person needs to find their own rhythm. One night, after everyone was asleep, I sat alone in the living room and looked around at the familiar things. I could see traces of different seasons layered on top of each other. The years when it was only me, the years with children's laughter added in, and now this stage where everything was beginning to shift. I didn't know how it would end. I didn't know whether today's choices would pull us closer together or push us farther apart. But I knew one thing. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't trying to write a script for anyone. I wasn't trying to make this story right by some standard. I was just standing here, ready to receive whatever came, whatever shape it took. And in that acceptance, I felt a strange kind of relief, like I'd just set down a burden I'd always believed I could never put down. I knew we were getting close to a point where things would have to change more clearly. Not right now, but soon. And when that time came, I wanted to have enough calm to neither cling nor push away, just to be there, at the right time, in the right role. The decision didn't arrive in a single day, and it wasn't spoken in one sentence. It formed slowly, through long evenings, through the times Ethan stayed quiet longer than usual, through Lily's eyes whenever she looked at her brother. I didn't ask either of them first. I waited until they spoke on their own, because I had promised myself I wouldn't place more pressure on either one. Ethan was the one who spoke. One afternoon, he stood at the edge of the living room doorway, his hands in his jacket pockets, like he was about to step outside even though it wasn't dark yet. "Grandma," he said, his voice low and steady, "I want to try living with Mom for a while." I looked at him for a long time. There was no impulse in his words, no challenge, just a desire to try, to know, to experience for himself the part of life he'd been missing. Lily didn't say anything right then. She sat in her chair, gripping the hem of her shirt, her eyes fixed on the floor. I turned to her, not asking, "Are you going?" but asking, "How do you feel?" Lily looked up, her eyes wet but her voice very clear. "I want to stay." No explanation, just stay. In that moment, I felt something inside me split in two. One half wanted to keep Ethan here, wanted to say he didn't have to go anywhere to understand where he belonged. The other half understood that if I stopped him, I would only repeat another cycle. It hurt in a very quiet way, but I didn't stop him. I didn't argue, I only nodded. "I'm not holding you," I said to Ethan slowly, letting each word settle. "I'm just opening the door." I saw his shoulders loosen a little, like he'd just been given permission to breathe. Lily turned to look at me, her eyes wavering but not accusing. I placed my hand over hers, felt that familiar warmth, and knew the three of us were stepping into a hard season. Laura didn't promise anything. When I called her to tell her about Ethan's decision, Laura only said she understood. No, everything will be okay. No, don't worry, Mom. Just understood. I didn't know what that meant in real life, but I didn't ask for more. I'd learned that some promises only soothe you for a moment, then leave behind empty spaces that are hard to fill. On the day Ethan left, I helped him pack. Not much. Clothes, a few books, an old pair of headphones. We worked in silence, not because of tension, but because no one wanted to say something too big in a small room. When Laura came to pick him up, we stood on the front porch. Ethan hugged Lily very tightly, longer than I expected. Lily cried, but she didn't cling to her brother's shirt. She stood straight, like she'd decided she wouldn't make things harder. Ethan hugged me last. "I'll call," he said. I nodded and didn't add any warnings or advice. I knew if I started, I wouldn't know where to stop. When the car pulled away, I watched until it disappeared at the end of the road. Then I went inside, closed the door, and for the first time in a long time, the house felt quiet in a different way. The emptiness showed up fast, not because there was less noise, but because a familiar rhythm was missing. A mug no one used anymore, a pair of shoes no longer in the corner by the door. Lily and I adjusted our routine slowly, like two people learning how to live in a space that had changed shape. I learned to accept that this family no longer had its old form, and maybe never would again. Some evenings, after Lily had fallen asleep, I sat alone in the living room and listened to the wind outside the window. I didn't blame myself, and I didn't comfort myself either. I just let the emptiness exist, without trying to fill it. I understood that emptiness was the price of not clinging, and I accepted paying it. One morning, a few weeks later, I opened the mailbox out front like I always did. Between bills and junk mail, there was a cream-colored envelope, handwriting that felt familiar, but I had to look twice to recognize. My name was written neatly and slowly, as if the writer had weighed every stroke. I stood on the porch for a long time with the envelope in my hand, not opening it right away. I knew that whatever was inside, it would force me to take one more step into this story. And this time, I wasn't sure whether I was ready. I opened the letter in the afternoon, while Lily was still at school, and the house was so quiet I could hear the paper softly rustling in my hands. The envelope wasn't sealed with glue, just carefully folded shut. Inside were a few handwritten pages in Laura's writing, no longer as rushed as I remembered, but still with the familiar rhythm of someone who often pauses mid-sentence to think. There was no apology at the start, no "Mom, I was wrong," and no words trying to smooth things over. Laura began by admitting her own weakness. She wrote that there had been days she woke up without the strength to even name herself, days when every choice felt heavy as stone. She wrote about the fear of coming back and discovering that everyone was better off without her, a fear that makes someone want to return and disappear at the same time. She didn't blame me, and she didn't blame circumstances. She only wrote that, at certain times, she hadn't been strong enough to do what needed to be done. I read slowly, not because the handwriting was hard, but because I wanted each sentence to have time to settle. In some parts, Laura admitted she had leaned on me, staying like a life preserver, without having the courage to ask how long that life preserver could hold. In other parts, she wrote that when she heard me say, "I'm just opening the door," she understood that some doors can't be pulled toward yourself forever. She wrote that she didn't know where the future would go, but she knew she no longer wanted to hide in silence. There were no promises in the letter, no concrete plan, no clear proposal to rebuild anything, only an admission that she had been weak, afraid, and had chosen to retreat instead of face things. And maybe, for Laura, being able to write that down was already a long distance from 16 years ago. I folded the letter, set it on the table, and sat still. In that moment, I realized I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel the relief I'd imagined either, just a different kind of quiet, deeper, with fewer sharp edges. I knew some people need an apology to move forward. I also knew that for some, when an apology comes too late, it can't do what everyone hopes it will. For me, this letter didn't close anything. It only placed another piece of truth on the table. I didn't write back, not because I had nothing to say, but because I didn't want to turn Laura's admission into an exchange. I was afraid that if I wrote, I'd accidentally place another burden on her, a burden to respond, to promise, to repair. I chose silence not to punish her, but to give what had just been said room to breathe. I also reminded myself that my memory, what I remember, what I feel, may have been rearranged by the years. The story I tell myself is how I look back, not a sentence handed down to anyone. I wasn't certain enough to judge Laura's motives, and I didn't want to trap the past inside neat conclusions. I only knew how I had lived and the choices I had made within what I was able to do. I put the letter in the drawer, tucked beneath old papers and my worn journal. I didn't lock it away. I didn't hide it. I just stored it there, like something that exists alongside my present life, not something that has to be mentioned every day. Life went on in small rhythms. Lily and I slowly got used to a house with fewer people in it, quieter dinners, slower mornings. I was getting older. That couldn't be denied. But with age, I felt lighter. Not because there was less to do, but because I tried less to control what was never truly mine to control. I learned to let unanswered questions stay where they were, without forcing them to answer right away. Some evenings I sat reading, yellow lamplight falling across the page, and I thought about Laura not with the urge to fix anything, but with a gentle curiosity. What kind of person she might become when she stopped running. I thought about Ethan, about the road he was trying out, and I thought about Lily, who chose to stay but wasn't required to stand still. I realized that this family, even without its old shape, still existed, imperfect but real. When I closed the drawer, I didn't know how this story would end. Maybe there would be more meetings. Maybe there wouldn't. Maybe one day I'd write back, or maybe that letter would sit there for a very long time. What I knew for sure was that I no longer needed a clear conclusion in order to keep living. And maybe it was that uncertainty that brought me closer to what I'd been searching for years. A peace that doesn't come from everything being resolved, but from accepting things as they are. I returned the key on a quiet morning when the sun hadn't yet warmed the front step. Laura stood in the doorway holding a cup of cold coffee, looking at me like she was waiting for an opening line. I didn't have one. I just placed the key into her palm and slowly closed her fingers around it. No promises, no conditions, no instructions for the future, just returning something that had once been handed over at a time when we both believed it was temporary. Laura didn't ask why. She nodded lightly as if she understood some decisions don't need explaining. We stood there for a few more seconds, then I turned away. I didn't look back, not out of coldness, but because I'd learned that in some moments, if you look 1 second longer, you'll want to hold on to more than you should. After that, time moved in a very different rhythm. Ethan visited often. He grew fast, bringing new stories, new questions that no longer searched for permission. We talked like people who know each other well, not to make up for anything, but to stay current with each other. Lily was different. She called, stopped by sometimes, but not regularly. There were long gaps, and I respected them. I understood that everyone keeps connection in their own way, some through presence, some through just enough distance. I lived alone again, not for the first time, but for the first time with a different feeling. The house no longer had to adjust to school schedules, early dinners, or late-night conversations. I rearranged things, not to erase traces, but to make room for the present. Some mornings, I made coffee for one, sat watching sunlight slide across the wooden floor, and realized I wasn't as empty as I'd once feared. I felt full in a quiet way. Our story wasn't complete. It didn't end with a family reunion meal or a promise kept perfectly, but it was real. Real in the way ordinary life usually is, with gaps, things left unsaid, and decisions without a soundtrack. I learned that family isn't about holding tight, but about knowing when to let go. Letting go isn't because the love is gone, but because you love in a way that doesn't leave someone gasping for air. Love doesn't guarantee happiness. It doesn't promise a gentle ending, but without it, everything is surely hollow. Between those two truths, I chose love with boundaries, a choice that isn't easy but necessary. I also want to say this clearly in the steady voice of someone who has lived long enough to know she can be wrong. The story you've just heard is fictional, pieced together and edited from many slices of real life and human experience, told through my memory and personal interpretation. It isn't meant to confirm objective events. It doesn't represent absolute right and wrong. It doesn't assign motives, and it doesn't encourage anyone to copy what's done here. I'm telling it to reflect, not to judge. If, in real life, you're in a similar situation, pulled between love and boundaries, seek guidance, talk early with the people involved, and set clear boundaries. Slow, kind conversations often save more than rushed decisions. Before I end, I want to thank you for staying with me this far. If you're listening from some city out there, leave me a comment and tell me where you're from. If you've walked through fragile family boundaries, held on, let go, or are learning how to do both, share your experience. Tap like if this story touched you, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss other everyday stories, slow, thoughtful, and not quick to conclude. Thank you for listening. Somewhere, maybe very close, I think we're all learning the same lesson, knowing when to hold the key and when to give it back.